Nobody told Deja it would become the best part of her week. She had not planned on returning to the same table by the window every Tuesday and Thursday. She had not planned on anything really when she walked into Carver's for the first time on a cold November morning 18 months ago, her car smelling like overnight shift and her feet still aching from 6 hours on linoleum. She had just wanted coffee and something hot that was not a vending machine breakfast sandwich. She had not planned on a waitress named Portia remembering her name by her third visit, or her order by her fifth, or the small, specific fact that she liked her grits without cheese because dairy made her head pound before noon. She had not planned on feeling for the first time in a very long time like a person someone was genuinely glad to see. Portia didn't know she was serving one of 41. She didn't know the quiet woman who came in twice a week, always wearing the same navy scrub jacket with a small bleach mark near the left pocket, was conducting anything at all. She just knew her as Deja. 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat, grits, no cheese, black coffee, and she always left $4 on a check that never exceeded $9. She came in alone. She sat at the same table. She was almost always reading something on her phone when Portia arrived with the coffee, and she would look up and smile, and the smile was real, and Portia had learned to watch for it. This is the part the newspapers would later get mostly wrong. They would say it was a test. They would describe it as surveillance, as a corporate audit dressed up in scrubs and kindness. They would miss the part where Deja wasn't testing anyone. She was just tired, and Carver's Diner on Hale Street was warm, and the waitress there was the first person in a very long time who made her feel like a regular rather than a stranger in her own life. What she was testing, if she was testing anything at all, was whether that feeling was real. Whether a person could do this job, the actual job of making someone feel seen, day after day in a diner that smelled like old coffee and maple syrup, for $9 and change plus whatever the table left. Whether it held, it held. If you've ever walked into a place where someone already knew what you needed before you opened your mouth, you know what Portia gave Deja every Tuesday and Thursday morning for a year and a half. Drop a comment and tell us if you've ever had someone like that in your life, because some people don't know what they're worth. Stay close, because this story is just getting started. Portia Lewis was 37 years old. She had been a waitress at Carver's for 9 years. She had a daughter named Maya, who was 11, and who had a loose front tooth she was refusing to pull because she decided she would wait for it to fall on its own. She had a 2009 Corolla with a front passenger window that didn't go all the way down anymore, and she had $412 in her savings account, which she had been working toward one shift at a time since February, when the refrigerator had died and she'd spent the savings she had on a second-hand replacement. She lived 12 minutes from the diner by car and 19 on foot, which she knew because she had walked it 17 times in the past 2 years when the Corolla wouldn't start in the morning. She did not think of herself as somebody doing something exceptional. She thought of herself as somebody doing her job. The job was, on paper, simple. Take the order, bring the food, keep the coffee coming. But Portia had figured out, over 9 years of early mornings and lunch rushes and slow Tuesdays, that the actual job was something else entirely. The actual job was noticing. It was the couple in booth 4 who always ordered for each other and never touched their phones. It was the older man who came in on Fridays with a newspaper he'd already finished reading, who just wanted somewhere to sit that wasn't his apartment. It was Deja, with the bleach mark on the sleeve, who always asked for the grits without cheese, and who had looked, that first morning 18 months ago, like a person who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally just set it down at the nearest table. Portia noticed. She noticed the small things because she had learned, the hard way and the slow way, that the small things were the only things you could actually give another person in the span of a meal. You couldn't fix their morning. You couldn't fix the shift they'd just worked or the one waiting for them on the other side of their coffee. But you could bring the cup before they asked. You could remember the grits, no cheese. You could say her name like you were glad it was her name. She had developed, over 9 years, a kind of mental ledger she ran on every regular. Not consciously, not as a system she had ever named or written down, just the accumulation of 1,000 mornings. Table 6 by the window always wanted the check early. Not because they were in a rush, but because the uncertainty of not having it bothered them. The woman who came in every other Wednesday with the toddler needed the crackers without being asked because the toddler would start in on the sugar packets if the crackers weren't there inside the first 3 minutes. The construction crew that came in rotating Fridays, never the same four men twice, preferred their coffee refilled silently, without eye contact. Not because they were rude, but because they were tired in that particular pre-dawn way that doesn't want any social effort put back on it. She met every one of them exactly where they were. This was not a technique she had read about, it was something she had worked out by watching what happened when she missed it, the slight deflation in a regular's shoulders when you came to the table too early and interrupted a thought, the way a solo diner would stop eating with the same ease when the room got too loud and nobody adjusted. She had learned to read the room the way some people learn to read weather. It was not instinct, it was practice made quiet. Maya knew her mother was good at her job the way children know things about their parents before they can articulate them. She would sometimes stop by the diner after school on slow Thursdays, sitting at the counter with a juice and her homework, watching her mother work the room. She had said once, with the flat certainty of an 11-year-old, that her mom knew what people needed before they sat down. Portia had laughed and said that wasn't true, but it was a little true. It was the kind of thing you couldn't teach and couldn't fake, and she had been doing it for 9 years without anyone ever calling it a skill. Deja Moss was 41 years old. She had built something that took her 22 years. She had started at the bottom of it, literally, age 19, working the counter of a lunch spot in Cincinnati that she would later, at 24, purchase for $11,000 she'd saved and borrowed and scraped together in ways she didn't fully tell her mother about. She had turned that lunch counter into a diner. She had turned that diner into 3. She had spent her late 20s and her 30s learning, mostly by doing, what made a place work and what made it fail. And the answer she kept arriving at was not the food, though the food mattered, and not the decor, though the decor mattered too. The answer was the room. The answer was whether a person walked out of the place feeling better than they walked in. She had written that down once on a paper napkin during a flight from Cleveland to Chicago, and she had kept that napkin in the inside pocket of her work bag ever since. The paper soft and creased, almost to translucence from the folding and unfolding. There had been lean years in the middle of that, years when the second location almost took down the first, and a tax situation in her early 30s that had required her to become a person who understood tax law better than she had ever intended to. There had been a partnership that dissolved badly and cost her 18 months she did not have. There had been a year, the one she did not talk about in interviews, when she had seriously considered stepping back to something smaller, something that did not carry 40 people's livelihoods inside its margins. She had not stepped back. She had instead hired the right people, learned to trust them, and built the financial architecture that let a thing survive its own growing pains. The 22 years were not a straight line. They were the shape that all real things are, irregular and expensive and occasionally wrong, and she had accumulated a specific kind of knowledge from them that could not be acquired any other way, which was the knowledge of exactly what was hard about what she was trying to do. She had 41 locations now. Carver's was location 38. She had purchased Carver's out of a small bankruptcy proceeding 14 months before she walked through the door for the first time wearing the bleach-marked scrub jacket, which was not, in fact, a scrub jacket at all. It was a navy zip-up she'd bought at a clothing store because it read, at a glance, like a uniform, which was what she'd been aiming for. She had learned years ago that the best way to understand what was actually happening inside one of her locations was to be inside it, without anyone knowing she was there. Her vice president of operations, a man named Tyrone, who had been with her since location 4, called it the walkabout. She called it going to breakfast. She had not expected to go back 37 times. She had not expected to find herself looking forward to it on Monday nights, the small anticipatory warmth of knowing the coffee would be hot and the grits would be right, and Portia would come to the table and say, "Good morning," like she meant it, because she did mean it. Portia meant everything she said, which Deja had learned to identify in people as a form of discipline, a choice made 1,000 times rather than a quality simply possessed. She had watched Portia work an entire Tuesday morning once, tracking her from table to table the way you'd watch a surgeon move through a procedure, and what she saw was precision. What she saw was a woman who had turned noticing into a practice and warmth into a method, and neither of those things undercut the other because the warmth was real too. The precision was in service of the warmth. She had looked down at her notepad, the small one she kept in her jacket pocket, and written one word. She kept that notepad page too. The diner itself had needed work when Deja's company acquired it. The previous ownership had let three things slide simultaneously, which is exactly two more things than any diner can sustain: the line equipment, the schedule consistency, and the culture. When culture goes in a small diner, it shows in everything from the way the condiments are stocked to the way a server holds a coffee pot. You can fix equipment and you can build a schedule, but you cannot manufacture the belief that the customer in front of you is worth your best attention at 6:45 in the morning. That either lives in the room or it doesn't. It had not lived in Carver's when Deja's team took over. Then she started coming in and she found Portia. The operational improvements had proceeded on their normal timeline. New line equipment installed by March, schedule restructured by April. The bathroom situation resolved finally and thoroughly by May. Deja watched all of it unfold from her corner table and her coffee and her eggs over easy. She watched the diner settle into what it was becoming, which was good. She watched Portia remain exactly who she had been throughout, unchanged by the shift in ownership and unchanged by the small improvements accreting around her, because a person who is that good at something doesn't require a renovation to know it. She just kept coming to the table. She just kept bringing the coffee. What happened in July was not something Deja had planned. She had come in on a Thursday, her usual time, and she had found Portia at the counter before the morning rush, refilling the syrup dispensers, and she'd overheard something she had not been meant to overhear. Portia was on the phone, very quietly, speaking in the tone that people use when they are trying not to let a difficult conversation take over their whole face. The refrigerator at home had stopped cooling again, she said. Not the same one, a different one, the second-hand one. She had called the landlord and the landlord had said next week. She had a daughter. She had things that needed to stay cold. She would figure it out, she said. She would figure it out. Deja sat down at her table. She looked at the window. She had a rule against intervening in the personal circumstances of location staff. She had built that rule out of experience and necessity, because the impulse to fix things directly, to hand someone an envelope or solve their situation on the spot, created complications that a business could not sustain at scale, and that the recipient of the fix usually did not want on those terms. She had a rule. She held the rule in her mind and looked at the window, and then she ordered her breakfast when Portia came over, smiling like she always smiled, and Deja smiled back and said, "Good morning." And the morning proceeded the way mornings at Carver's proceeded, warm and orderly and exactly right. She called Tyrone when she got to her car. She told him she needed a full operational review of Carver's compensation structure, specifically the server compensation, specifically whether there was alignment between their highest performing staff and their current wage and benefit tier. She told him to have it to her by Monday. She did not tell him why. Tyrone had been with her since location 4. He knew when to ask and when to just pull the numbers. The review came back on Monday. It confirmed what she had suspected, which was that Portia Lewis, by any metric Deja's company had ever applied to front-of-house performance, was operating well above the ceiling of her current pay tier. Customer return rate for her section versus comparable sections at comparable locations was up by 22 points. Average check size was not meaningfully different, which was expected because Portia didn't upsell, she didn't push, and Deja respected that. What was different was that people came back. They came back and they sat in her section and they ordered the same things and they left the same tip every time. And the consistency of that number, the $4 on the $9 check or the 15% on the $12 check, was not wealth, but it was loyalty. And loyalty in a diner was the only metric that had ever mattered to Deja. She looked at the compensation review for a long time. She thought about the paper napkin in her work bag and the one word in the notepad, and she thought about 37 mornings and grits without cheese, and what it cost a person to show up with that quality of care, shift after shift, for 9 years, on wages that hadn't materially changed in 3. She thought about a second-hand refrigerator and a landlord who said, "Next week." She thought about what she had been doing for 18 months, which was coming to the diner to understand the diner, and what she had understood, which was sitting at the front counter right now, filling syrup dispensers, and had no idea. She called Tyrone again. She told him she needed to restructure not just Carver's, but what she was thinking of as the whole recognition gap. She described what she meant by that, which was the distance between what a company's best people actually contributed and what they were actually receiving for it, and she told him that Carver's was going to be where they built the new model. She was thinking about it as a pilot, a test of whether you could close that gap in a way that worked structurally and not just as a gesture. Tyrone listened. He asked the right questions. He pulled up the cost analysis while they were still on the phone. He said it was possible. He said it would take some time. She said she wasn't in a hurry. She had been patient before. The August morning that everything changed started the way all of them had started, with Deja coming in at her usual time and Portia already moving through the dining room, coffee in hand, doing the thing she did, which was make the room feel like someone had thought about it. There was a family in the back corner that Portia had already navigated around twice to deliver food without making them feel crowded. There was the older man with the newspaper in booth 3, and Portia stopped to refill his cup without being asked, and he looked up and said, "Thank you." And the way he said it was the way a person says something they mean. Deja watched all of this from the door before she sat down, because she always spent the first 30 seconds watching the room before she let the room know she was there. She sat at her table. Portia came over. "Morning, Deja." And then, without a pause, without a glance at a pad, 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat, grits no cheese, black coffee." "That's me," Deja said. Portia smiled, wrote nothing down, and went to put the order in. Deja reached into her work bag and took out a small folder and set it on the table. She did not open it yet. She looked at the window for a moment and thought about a 19-year-old counting change behind a lunch counter in Cincinnati 22 years ago, and thought about how you could not have told that 19-year-old anything that would have made this morning feel less strange, because strange was the right word, and strange was not a bad word. It was just the honest one. When Portia set the eggs down, Deja said, "Do you have a minute when things slow down a little?" Portia looked at her. She had been doing this long enough to know what that phrasing could mean and what it usually meant, and there was a flicker in her eyes, brief and carefully managed, that Deja recognized as the look of someone who has learned not to assume the news is good. "Give me about 15 minutes, she said. It was closer to 20 because the family in the back corner needed boxes, and the older man with the newspaper ordered a second cup of toast that Portia had to walk back to the kitchen for. Deja drank her coffee and watched and did not mind. When Portia came and sat across from her, she had taken off her apron and folded it over her arm, which was a small detail that said she understood this was a different kind of conversation. Deja opened the folder and turned it so Portia could read the first page. She had prepared it herself, which was not how she normally did things, but which had felt necessary for this particular conversation. The first page was a summary of the operational data, the return rate numbers, the section performance metrics. Not because she wanted to make the conversation clinical, but because she had learned over 22 years that when you tell someone they are exceptional, the first thing they do is doubt you, and the second thing they do is look for the angle, and the cleanest way past both of those reflexes is to show them the numbers first and let the numbers say what you're about to say. Portia looked at the first page. She looked at it for a long time. She was not reading fast, she was reading carefully. The way a person reads something they don't quite believe and want to be certain they've understood. She turned to the second page, which was the compensation proposal. She stopped there. "I don't understand," she said. "You've been here 9 years," Deja said. "You have the highest customer retention rate of any server across all 38 of my locations. That's what that first page is." Portia looked up from the paper. "All 38, she said. "I own Carver's," Deja said. "I've owned it since before you met me. I've been coming in for 18 months. The room was quiet for a moment. The morning rush had thinned and the kitchen sounds from the back filled the silence without filling it exactly. Portia looked at the apron in her hands. "The scrub jacket," she said. "I bought it at a clothing store. I'm sorry. I know that's a strange thing to hear." "You're not a nurse." "No." Portia was quiet again. Then she said, "You came in for 1.5 years. 37 times, Deja said. "I kept a record." What happened then was not what Deja would have predicted. She had expected questions or defensiveness or the complicated particular silence of someone trying to decide whether to be angry. What happened was that Portia laughed. It was short and involuntary, and she pressed her free hand to her mouth immediately after, like she was surprised at herself, and then her eyes filled, and she did not let the tears come, but they were there, visible at the rim. "I thought you were a regular," she said. "You made me one," Deja said. She let that land. Then she tapped the second page of the folder. "This is what I'm proposing. A new role, operations coordinator for the front of house development program I'm building out of Carver's. The salary is there on the second line. It comes with benefits, and I'm adding a line about the refrigerator because I heard you on the phone in July, and I know I'm not supposed to do things like that, but I'm doing it anyway." Portia looked at the salary figure for a long time. She had been making the same base wage for 3 years. The number on the second page was not the same. It was not close to the same. She looked up from the folder and then back down at it, the way people do when they are trying to determine whether a thing is real. She touched the paper at its edge. Her hand was steady, which cost her something, though her face did not show exactly how much. Outside the window, the bus moved again, a different one, and a woman with a stroller navigated around the corner with the particular focused efficiency of a person who has done that corner 100 times. The diner was settling into its mid-morning quiet, the space between the rush and the lunch crowd that Portia knew as well as she knew anything. The sound of the dishwasher running and a muffled radio from the kitchen, and nothing urgent. "Why?" she said. And then, when Deja began to respond, she stopped her. "Not why the job, why the mornings, why all of it. You own 40 restaurants. You didn't need to sit at my table for a year." Deja looked at the window for a moment. Outside, a city bus moved through the intersection, and the morning light was angling in through the glass at the low, specific angle it got in August, warm and slightly too bright. "When I was 19, she said, "I worked a lunch counter in Cincinnati, and there was a woman who used to come in on Wednesdays, and she remembered my name. That's all. She just knew my name. I had been there 4 months, and she knew my name, and I cannot tell you what that was worth to me on the days it was worth something." She paused. "I've been trying to figure out how to build that into 41 restaurants for 22 years, and I haven't figured it out yet, but I know what it looks like when someone already has it." Portia looked at her for a long moment. Long. "41 now," she said. "You said 38 before. I signed 3 more last week." Something shifted in Portia's expression. Something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it, the look of a person recalibrating toward a larger number than they had been holding. You know that feeling when you realize you've been seen not by accident but on purpose, not once but again and again by someone who had the power to do something about it and finally did? Drop a comment if this story landed somewhere real for you. There are more stories like this one, and they're worth your time. There were negotiations after that because there are always negotiations, and Deja was not a person who made offers she intended to adjust, but she was also not a person who wanted the whole thing to feel like a transaction, so she gave Portia time and space and the number of a lawyer Deja knew personally who could explain the contract in terms that were plain. Portia called the lawyer. Portia asked good questions, which did not surprise Deja. Portia's questions were, without exception, about the scope of the role and what she would be expected to learn, and whether her daughter could visit the office sometimes because Maya's school let out at 3:15 and childcare was the part of the logistics that needed solving. Deja told her about the school partnership she'd started at Location 22, which had an after-school arrangement with a learning centre 2 blocks from the office. She told her Maya was welcome to work on homework in the conference room on days when the arrangement didn't cover it. She said this without fanfare and moved on to the next agenda item, because this was the part she had learned to do quietly, to make the practical, humane thing feel like the obvious thing rather than the generous thing, because generosity implies exceptionalism, and she was trying to build a structure where this kind of accommodation was just how things were. Portia signed the contract on a Friday afternoon. She worked her last shift at Carver's the following Thursday because she had asked to, because she wanted to finish the week properly, and because there were several customers she had been serving for years who deserved to hear it from her rather than find a different face at their table without explanation. The older man with the newspaper cried a little, which he did not expect, and which he covered by blowing his nose into his paper napkin and saying he was fine, he had a cold. Portia told him she'd been there 9 years and she was going to miss this room. He said he'd been coming in for 11. They agreed, without either of them saying so, that the room was something worth missing. Maya came by after school on that last Thursday. She sat at the counter and drank her juice and watched her mother work the room the way she always watched, with the quiet, concentrated attention of a child who understood she was watching something real. When Portia's shift ended and she came to the counter, Maya said, without preamble, "Are you sad?" "A little," Portia said, "but mostly I'm not." Because of the new job? Because of the new job, and because of why I got it. Maya considered this with the gravity of an 11-year-old who had been listening more carefully than anyone had registered. Because you were nice to people, she said. Because I paid attention, Portia said. Maya nodded like this confirmed something. Then she pulled her loose tooth out with 2 fingers finally, right there at the counter, and held it up like a small, hard-won thing, which it was. The first time Portia walked into the corporate office in her new capacity, she was wearing a dark blazer over a white shirt, and she had her hair in a twist out that she'd spent 40 minutes on the night before, and she felt completely certain that she was going to be found out as someone who did not belong in this room. This was a feeling she had been warned about by her cousin, who had made a similar transition 10 years ago from a retail floor to a district manager role, and who had told her plainly that the feeling would come and would not immediately go and was not to be trusted. Portia had filed this information in the part of her mind that holds useful things. The first meeting she sat in was a review of service quality metrics across Deja's locations. They were looking at the data the same way Deja had shown her on that August morning: return rates and average dwell time and customer comment patterns across the chain. And Portia sat at the conference table and looked at the numbers and began, without quite deciding to translate them. She had 9 years of actual mornings behind the data, 9 years of knowing what a booth in the back corner needed versus what the counter stools needed, 9 years of understanding the invisible architecture of a room that felt right versus one that merely functioned. The translation was not difficult. It was, in fact, the most natural thing she had done in years. She spoke up about halfway through the meeting. She said that the underperforming metrics at locations 7, 19, and 31 all appeared to share a scheduling characteristic she had seen create the same problems at Carver's before the restructure. Too many new hires placed on the morning sections that required the most relationship management with regulars, because mornings were when operators assumed you needed less skill, when actually mornings were when you needed the most. Tyrone, sitting across from her, looked up from his laptop. He asked her to say more about that, she said. More about that. The meeting went a direction it had not been going. Afterward, in the hallway, Deja fell into step beside her. Location 31, she said. You're right. I know you're right because I've been in that room and something felt off. And I couldn't name it. You named it in 11 minutes. 9 years, Portia said. That's what I'm paying for, Deja said. The program they built together over the following 8 months was not a training module and not a customer service manual, though it produced both of those things as byproducts. It was, at its core, an attempt to systematize something that Portia had done intuitively for 9 years: the practice of noticing, the architecture of being present with the person in front of you rather than processing them. They called it the Carver model internally, and they piloted it at locations in 3 cities, and they tracked the results the way Deja tracked everything, methodically and without assumption. They spent a lot of time in those early months trying to describe what Portia did in language that could travel to someone who had never met her. This turned out to be the hardest part. It was easy to describe the practices, the mental ledger, the specific attentiveness, the habit of arriving at the table slightly before it knew it needed you. It was harder to describe the underlying posture, the thing that made the practices feel like care rather than performance. Portia kept trying to find a shorter way to say it and eventually arrived at the same answer every time. You had to actually want to know, not as a strategy. Just genuinely want to know how someone took their coffee and what it meant that they were here alone at 6:40 in the morning, and whether today was a hard day or just an ordinary one. You had to be curious about people. If you faked the curiosity, they felt it. Every time. They put that in the program materials eventually. Not in those words, but in that spirit. And Deja made Portia say it in the orientation video they filmed at Carver's in February, which Portia found mortifying and which Tyrone said was the best 3 minutes of corporate video he had ever seen in his life. The return rate numbers moved, not everywhere and not immediately and not without the expected friction of implementation, which is always the part that tests whether an idea is real or just good on paper. But at the pilot locations, over 6 months, customer return rates climbed by an average of 18 points. And the metric that moved the most was one that Portia had proposed they measure, and that Deja's operations team had initially been skeptical of, which was whether customers reported feeling recognized. The skepticism had been that this was too soft to quantify. Portia had said they could quantify anything they asked about directly, and that people would tell you exactly how they felt if you asked them. They asked. The people told them. Deja had a small gathering at the Carver's location on the 1-year anniversary of Portia's first day in the new role. It was not a formal event, just the staff from the original location and a few people from the corporate team and the older man with the newspaper, who had been personally invited by Portia because that had seemed right. He came in his good coat, which Portia noticed. She brought him his coffee before he ordered it, and he laughed a little when she set it down. "Old habit," she said. "Good habit," he said. Deja gave a brief toast at the back of the room, which she had written and then half discarded in the taxi on the way over because it had started to sound like a speech rather than something true. What she said instead was approximately this, though she was not reading from anything, that Carver's Diner was the 38th restaurant she had ever bought, and it was not the biggest or the most complicated or the one in the best real estate, but it was the one that had taught her something she had been trying to learn for 22 years, which was not how to build a great diner, because she mostly knew that by now, but how to find the people who already knew something she didn't and give them room to say what they knew. She looked at Portia when she said it. Portia was standing near the counter with Maya, who had grown 3/4 of an inch since August and had a new front tooth that was slightly larger than the one it replaced, which 11-year-olds usually correct for within a year. She was drinking a juice she had ordered herself because she was at the diner, and you ordered when you were at the diner, and she was listening to the toast with the same careful attention she brought to watching her mother work the room. The older man with the newspaper raised his coffee cup. Someone behind him laughed at something, a warm sound, the specific acoustic quality of a room where the people in it are glad to be in it, which is the thing Deja had been chasing since she was 19 years old at a lunch counter and a woman knew her name, and now she was standing at the back of her 38th restaurant, and she felt for the first time in a long time like she had arrived somewhere she'd been trying to get to for the whole of her adult life. Portia caught her eye from across the room. She did not raise her cup or her voice. She just smiled, the real one, the same one she'd given Deja every Tuesday and Thursday for 18 months, and Deja smiled back, and the room held them both in its warm and ordinary light. There is a napkin in Deja's work bag, soft from folding, with one sentence on it. There is a page in a small notepad, with one word. The napkin says that the business is whether a person walks out feeling better than they walked in. The word in the notepad, the one she wrote after watching Portia work a Tuesday morning from table to table, is the kind of word that sounds simple until you have spent 22 years understanding what it costs. The word was rare. Maya's tooth grew in straight, the way they usually do. The refrigerator got replaced, the good kind this time, not second-hand. The Corolla finally got its window fixed in the spring, which was a small thing and also not, because Portia had driven for 3 years without fully being able to open the window, and the morning she could was ordinary in every way except that she rolled it all the way down on the highway and let the March air in. And she thought about what it felt like to be seen, which is what she had given other people for 9 years, and which she was only now learning to receive. She was still learning. That is perhaps the most human part of this story. Not the numbers, not the 38 locations or the 41 or the 18 months of Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The most human part is that the person best at making others feel recognized had to be taught, slowly, and by someone who loved the business she built, what it felt like when the recognition was for her. That it was allowed, that it was deserved, that it did not have to be earned fresh each morning the way the old wages had been. 1 table at a time, $4 on 9. She knew now. She was still learning, but she knew. And if you have ever had a Portia in your life, someone who remembered the small thing, who said your name like they were glad it was yours, you already know that this story is not really about diners or corporate structures or the distance between wages and worth, though it is about all of those things. It is about what happens when someone finally asks whether anybody noticed you. And the answer turns out to be yes. Quietly, yes. For 1.5 years, at a table by the window, with a cup of black coffee and eggs over easy and grits without the cheese. If that landed somewhere for you, tell us about your Portia in the comments. And if you have time for one more story like this one, there is another one waiting that we think you'll carry with you. This story is a work of fiction created for dramatic and entertainment purposes. All names, characters, businesses, and events are fictitious.